So welcome everyone. We're so glad you could join us. And Tina, I leave it up to you.
Thank you so much, Terry. I'm glad that you mentioned that I'm an an alumni member of Highlands. I actually spent 5 years at Highlands, I guess, and it was 5 great, incredible years. And it's been an honor for me to be part of the foundation board, I think for 25 years now. most of my professional life, I've been a member of the foundation board. And so I just want to say that it's been a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful experience for me at Highlands, and it's been a wonderful experience for me to serve on the foundation board. I also want to say many thanks to both Terry and to Julie for putting these programs together, virtual programs for us, because maybe one good thing that's come out of the virus is that we actually have the ability to reach many more people. I don't know, I've lost track of the Zoom presentations I've done about the downwinders, not only locally, but on a national level and an international level. I've participated in Zoom presentations about the downwinders all over the world over the last few months. So it's been a great way to communicate that maybe was one of those things, maybe the only good thing that's come out of dealing with a pandemic. So anyway, let me just get right into what I am hoping to discuss with you all today. I am the co-founder of an organization called the Tularosa Basin Downwinders Consortium, or TBDC for short. And we're a grassroots organization that was founded 15 years ago to bring attention to the negative health effects suffered by the people of New Mexico as a result of their overexposure to radiation after the Trinity test that was conducted in south central New Mexico in 1945. Today, what I'm going to discuss with you is, number one, the uniqueness of the Trinity test and what made it so fallout producing. And number two, the lifestyles of the people living in 1945 that meant that they were maximally exposed to radiation. Number three, I'm going to deliver some firsthand stories to you that have been told to me by people who experienced it. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what's called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that was set up in 1990, a full 30 years ago, to compensate other downwinders from other parts of the country. I hope that you all will find this enlightening. The unfortunate thing about this story is that it's been very suppressed throughout the 75-year history since Trinity. And that's an unfortunate thing because the people of New Mexico should know this story, and it should be taught actually as part of mid-school New Mexico history. So again, let me get to the test itself. The test was conducted in the desert of south central New Mexico in the area called the Tularosa Basin, and it's exactly that, a basin. It's a valley that exists between two pretty large mountain ranges. As a matter of fact, to the east of the Tularosa Basin is White Mountain, Sierra Blanca, which is the highest, most southern peak in the Rocky Mountains. And so it's truly this large basin that exists in south central New Mexico. The test took place at 5:30 in the morning, 5:29 and 45 seconds to be exact, in the morning of July 16th, 1945. The government had planned to detonate the device earlier in the morning, but because we had such a severe thunderstorm, they had to delay the actual detonation of the bomb. Now, everybody knows that July is part of our rainy season. It's the monsoon season here. And so it's no wonder that there was such a significant storm that day that delayed the detonation until later in the morning. The Trinity test was the only test conducted like itself. As you can well imagine, there was this rush to get that test done that day in advance of Truman's exam. And so the scientists that were working on the test had to make sure that the bomb detonated that morning and that it all went off as planned. They gave little consideration actually in advance of detonating the bomb to human health, although General Groves and Robert Oppenheimer, General Groves being the person that was given the task of developing the Manhattan Project, developing the bomb, and eventually testing it, and Robert Oppenheimer, who was the well-known physicist who was assigned to the science part of the project. They were warned ahead of time by the physicians who were assigned to the project that it would likely produce massive amounts of fallout, and that there would likely be consequences, health consequences to the people living in the neighboring area. So the test was the only test ever conducted on a platform 100 feet off the ground. And the reason that's significant is because the major part of the blast came down, intercepted the earth, had nowhere to go, and then took up an enormous amount of dirt, sand, animal, plant life, incinerated it, and took it into a fireball that rose 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere. The bomb itself produced more heat and more light than the sun. And that's why I say it incinerated the animal and plant life. It also melted the sand that was present at the site, at the actual test site, and produced what's called plutonium. Plutonium is the fusion of the sand that was melted in the process, and it's the fusion of that sand with the plutonium, and it created trinitite. I think I must have just made the mistake of calling the green glass plutonium. It was actually trinitite. And I always say it's remarkable. It's actually incredibly remarkable that the only place in the world where trinitite exists is at the site of the first nuclear explosion that took place in the desert of south central New Mexico, the only place where trinitite exists. Okay, so now you have this fireball going 7 miles past the atmosphere into the stratosphere, and we all know that when something like that goes up, it has to come down. Well, it did, and it came down as a radioactive ash that fell from the sky for days afterwards, and actually fell onto the people, the animals, everything in the vicinity that lived and was in the vicinity of the Trinity test site. Now, the government has always controlled the messaging about the population and the location, and what they've said continuously, even till today, is that the area was remote and uninhabited, that no one lived there, and so no one was harmed. The truth is, there were tens of thousands of people living in a 50-mile radius, and if you expand that radius 150 miles, the number grows to hundreds of thousands of people, because then it encompasses Albuquerque to the north and El Paso to the south. It encompasses everything in between to the west past Silver City, and everything in between to the east past Roswell and Artesia. And I'll get back to that 150-mile radius and why that's significant. So you have people now living in the immediate vicinity. We've identified ranching families that lived as close as 12 miles to the test site. And there was no plan to evacuate the numbers of people that lived in the surrounding area. There were towns as close as 20 miles, 30 miles, 40 miles, 50 miles. And the town I grew up in, Tularosa, the way the crows fly, is about 40, 45 miles from the test site. Carrizozo is about 35 miles away the crows fly from the test site. San Antonio is around 20 miles the way the crows fly. And so there were significant populations living in the area. So the test was incredibly inefficient because it was the first time it was ever done. The scientists were unsure exactly about what it was going to take to get this bomb to detonate. So they overpacked it with weapons-grade plutonium. They put a full 13 pounds of plutonium into the core of the bomb for the fission process, but only 3 pounds were necessary, which meant an entire 10 pounds of plutonium went up in that fireball and fell as the ash that came down from the sky. Now, plutonium is the most toxic substance known to man. And so now you have all of this plutonium dispersed all around the area and throughout the Tularosa Basin. You only have to absorb, ingest, or inhale 1 particle of plutonium, and it remains in your body for the remainder of your life, damaging cells and destroying tissue and organs. So you have a very inefficient bomb. It was never, a bomb was never again, 2 things to always remember about the Trinity bomb. A bomb was never again detonated on a platform 100 feet off the ground, and a bomb was never again produced that was so inefficient. Now, what they learned from Trinity was that they had created this massive fallout, and that's not what they wanted to do in Japan. What they wanted to do in Japan is produce massive destruction. And so they drew the conclusion that to detonate the bombs in Japan and make certain that they created destruction, they knew that they had to detonate those bombs much higher in the atmosphere. And so those bombs were detonated at 1,600 and 1,800 feet respectively. The bomb at Nagasaki was a replica of the bomb at Trinity, except that the bomb at Trinity was more powerful than the bomb that was detonated at Nagasaki, as it turns out. And so those are the unique characteristics about the Trinity bomb that made it so fallout producing. More fallout was produced at Trinity than was produced in Japan. Now I want to move on to discussing the lifestyles of the people in 1945 that meant that they were maximally exposed. First of all, no one had running water. You couldn't turn on a spigot and get water, or a faucet and get water. What that meant is people had to collect rainwater for the purpose of drinking, of bathing, of cleaning, of doing laundry. And so almost everybody had a cistern, or families had a cistern that they shared. In my particular family, I've been told that my great-grandmother and grandfather had a cistern, and that all of their children utilized that cistern as they became adults and established their own families, utilized that one cistern for the purpose of water. So people had pitched roofs on their homes, normally metal, corrugated metal pitched roofs, and they directed the water into a set of canales, downspouts, and then into a cistern. A cistern is essentially a holding tank. It could be either underground or above ground. It was normally plastered to seal it so that the water wouldn't seep out of the cistern. So now you're talking about detonating a highly a highly radioactive fallout producing bomb during the rainy season, when people would have been filling up their cisterns for many months to come. And now you have all that radiation being directed directly into the cistern, which is a closed, contained space. Nowhere for any of that radioactive fallout to go, but to remain in those cisterns. I've been told stories by my father, and I've read stories that other people have submitted to us about how when it would become dry, when the cisterns would become close to being dry, they would lower children into the cisterns to then clean them out. And what would happen is they would lower buckets in there, and the kids would literally scoop out the sludge from the bottom of the cistern into these buckets, and then it would be removed. Well, as you can well imagine, all of that sludge would have been radioactive after July 16th, 1945. And my father said that he participated in that process as a child in cleaning out the cistern. And then they would check to make sure that the cistern had no cracks, that its integrity remained in place. And if there was cracks in the plaster or whatever, all of that would be patched at that time. So those cisterns and the collection of water was very important. The other thing that existed, for example, in the little town I'm from, Tularosa, was an extensive ditch system. So a lot of these little towns had extensive ditch systems, or they had rivers, streams, lakes, holding ponds that they relied on for their water source. Tularosa has the most extensive ditch system in the whole state of New Mexico. And so, you know, people also relied on that water. Again, that water would have been fully contaminated by the bomb that was detonated. The other thing to remember is that there was no refrigeration in 1945. Nobody owned a refrigerator. Some people, if they had the means for it, what they owned was an ice box. So there was this booming ice business in Tularosa and in a lot of these small towns back in 1945. And if you had the means, you owned an ice box, which is basically, you know, what we would call an ice chest these days. You would put a block of ice inside of this box and you could refrigerate things for a few days, but it wasn't like what we depend on today as far as refrigeration. So what that means is there were no grocery stores, there were mercantile stores. And what you got in a mercantile were things like sugar, flour, coffee, cereal, rice, but you didn't buy dairy, you didn't buy any kind of produce, and you didn't buy meat in a grocery store. All of those things were produced by you locally. So everybody had a garden and an orchard, Everybody either had a milk cow or a goat for the purpose of dairy, or they went to the local dairy, and there were several in each town. You also raised animals for the purpose of meat. People had, again, cows, sheep, pigs, chickens. Everybody had a chicken coop, and the chickens produced eggs, and the chickens themselves were used as a source of protein. And then the men hunted. There was a great deal of hunting that took place back then. We still hunt today, but men hunted for small mammals, rabbits, deer, all sorts of birds, pheasants, quail, etc. And that's how people fed themselves. A lot of effort went into producing food for yourselves. And in July, it would have been the peak of the harvest. It would have been when women would have been harvesting as many fruits and vegetables as they could from their gardens and their orchards, and putting them into jars, canning that food for the winter. Again, all of this was now radioactive, because as that ash fell from the sky, it got into the soil, it got into the water, it got into every part of what people were consuming, and maximally exposing people to radiation. There's 3 routes of exposure to radiation. Inhalation, which would have been taking place because if you were outdoors, which people spent a lot of time outdoors in the summers here in New Mexico, they were even sleeping outdoors. You would actually inhale particles of radiation. It would stay on your skin for days, because if you don't have running water, you don't bathe regularly. You bathe less regularly. And what that meant is it would have remained on your skin and in your hair, on your scalp, until the time that you got to bathe again. And then ingestion. And of course, people would have been ingesting maximal amounts of radiation through their food and through their water. I want to tell you a couple of stories to give you an idea of what that day was like for people in New Mexico. So there was a gentleman from Tularosa who told me the story many times. His story is well documented and recorded, about how he was a student at the University of New Mexico. And he always said, it's not that I experienced the blast itself, but my father had sent me a telegram and said, you need to bring the family car back to Tularosa as soon as possible, because your brother is processing out of the Army at Fort Bliss in El Paso. And the only way that we can go get him is if you bring home the family car. So, this gentleman, he decided, Daryl Gilmore, he decided that that was the day he was going to travel from Albuquerque to Tularosa. Well, the other thing that we don't remember or recall well about 1945 is that most of the roads were dirt roads. So he said he got on the highway and drove from Albuquerque to Socorro on a paved road. And then just south of Socorro, he cut across the desert at San Antonio to travel to Carrizozo and then on to Tularosa. And it was July 16th. And he said that it was hot. So he had the windows down on the car, and he's driving along, and he meets a convoy of soldiers, and they stop him. And they said, whatever you do, don't stop, roll up your windows and get out of here as quick as you can, because there's poisonous gas in the air. And he thought, what are they talking about? And but he followed their advice. He said he had stopped once at what he now knows is the entry point to the Stallion Gate, because there is a pull-off there. There was an obvious pull-off, and he said he pulled off there to check the tires on the car. He's driving on a dirt road, so he was worried about the tires. He pulled off there, and then he got back on the road and drove to Tularosa. He said it took many, many hours to finally get home. And he said what was so peculiar about it is that when he got home, he had what looked like the worst sunburn of his life. He said, and it wasn't just on my arms or my face like you would expect. He said it was all over my chest and my back and my legs. And he said, I've had multiple cancers. I've had so many skin cancers, I've lost track of them. And he said, but the worst of it is I brought all that radiation home with me, and my mother and father both died from cancer, and my sister died from cancer. And I used to tell him, Daryl, it's not that you brought it home with you. That radiation fell from the sky for days and got on everything in Tularosa. So you didn't bring it home with you. Daryl passed away this summer. God bless him, because he had made himself available to tell that story. And I always say there was such a lack of concern for human health that the government didn't even have the decency to close that roadway that day so that nobody would travel across there. I'm quite certain that when Daryl pulled over to check the tires on his vehicle, he was probably about 8 miles away from the Trinity test site, and he got beta burns on his body. And that's not something that's a far reach in sort of, making that assumption, because there were cows grazing out in the desert that day that lost their hides. The radiation, the beta burns that they received actually burned the hides off of these cows. And the government bought quite a few of those cows from the ranchers in the area and took them to Oak Ridge, Tennessee to study them. But they didn't buy all of them. And so that year at the cattle sale, everybody thought it was remarkable how many cows were either white or half white, and how all the cows had eye cancer. And they'd never seen anything like this before. The second story I want to share with you is told by a lady named Barbara Kent. And Barbara now lives in California, but lived in El Paso at the time. And her family was a family of means. Her father was a physician. And on July 15th, 1945, her mother and her brother and Barbara loaded up in their family car, and they headed off to Ruidoso. And Ruidoso is probably about 55 miles away the crows fly from the test site, but it is on the other side of Sierra Blanca, the mountain that I mentioned earlier that's the highest peak, the highest, most southern peak of the Rocky Mountains. And Barbara said that her brother and mother dropped her off at dance camp, and then they went and found a motel room in Ruidoso because they didn't want to make the long drive back on the dirt roads to El Paso that day. So that morning of July 16th at about 5:30 in the morning, Barbara, along with all the other young ladies in the dance camp, and her mother and her brother were all knocked out of their beds and onto the floor. And Barbara said they were terrified. They ran out of the building where they were sleeping. The bunks were set up in this building at this camp. And the camp host finally got them all settled down. And I think she told them something like it might have been, a boiler or something. And Barbara's mother and brother, the story that has been told to me is that they actually crawled underneath the bed and stayed there for a period of time because they didn't know what they had just experienced. Imagine that the bomb created so much light, it was greater than the sunlight produced by the sun. So everybody has told me the flash of light lasted for quite a bit of time, and it was so intense you knew that it was something you'd never witnessed before because it was even brighter than daylight. So Barbara said that they went back to bed and settled in finally after a period of time, and then later in the day, they all put their bathing suits on and made their way down to the creek that ran next to the camp. And she said what they noticed immediately was that there was an ash falling from the sky, but they said they thought it was snow. And they thought, it's snowing in July, what's going on? And they started playing in this ash. They started rubbing it on their faces and on their arms. And she said, we even stuck our tongues out, and some of it landed on our tongues, and it was warm. And she said, and we just couldn't figure out what the heck was happening. Well, I always tell Barbara, you're alive to tell this story because people wouldn't believe it if I told it. All of those young ladies, except for one that were in that camp, and I believe there was a total of 10, died from cancer. Let me backtrack. All of those ladies in that camp, except for 2, died from cancer before the age of 40. Barbara got cancer. As a matter of fact, Barbara got 3 different cancers, but she's alive today, bless her heart. She had 3 miscarriages, and all of her daughters have had cancer. I always say that it is an amazing story that Barbara has to tell about what she experienced that day. And the stories are so profound. They sometimes are shocking. They're so profound because the experience was so intense. People said that it was something they would never be able to forget what they experienced that day. So let me talk a little bit about where we're at today. Well, last summer, a paper was released about how after a 10-year decline in infant mortality in the state of New Mexico, in the months directly after the Trinity test, we saw a huge spike in infant mortality in New Mexico. There's a woman on our steering committee. Her name is Bernice Gutierrez. Bernice was born 8 days before the bomb was detonated in the town of Carrizozo. And I always tell her, Bernice, You must have the most amazing, strong body because you were one of the babies that survived that summer. So we had babies dying, and the healthcare professionals from New Mexico contacted the Manhattan Project and said, we're losing babies and we don't know what's going on, and nothing we do, it seems to be salvaging their lives, and we need help here. And the Manhattan Project actually, in consultation with their legal department, decided that this thing to do would be to deny that they were seeing any spikes in infant mortality, any data that pointed to that, and that they knew of anything that might have caused this. The truth is, exposure to radiation, the dose that you receive, is a factor of your body mass, and a baby's body mass would have been so small, so insignificant compared to the radiation doses that they wouldn't be able to withstand it. Couple that with the fact that their mothers would have been breastfeeding them, and mammals, humans, concentrate radiation in their mammary glands. So as their mothers nursed them, those babies were receiving enormous doses of radiation and they died. I say now that we had casualties from the Trinity test and they were our babies. And it's absolutely unconscionable that our government had an opportunity, number one, to evacuate people and chose not to. Number two, to inform people afterwards and chose not to. And then number three, when they had an opportunity to intercede and maybe save the lives of some of our children, they decided that that wasn't important. We have a fund called the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act that's been set up since 1990 to compensate people downwind of the Nevada test site. And New Mexico has never been included in that fund, even to the extent that we were downwind of the Nevada test site. Remember earlier I mentioned about the 150-mile radius? Well, after the Trinity test, the physicians that were assigned to the test said some really remarkable things, and I won't get them exactly right, but it was something to the effect of, one of them said, we so overexposed people to radiation, but they couldn't prove it and we couldn't prove it, so we believed we just got away with it. That was one thing. Another one said, we so overexposed people to radiation and we can never do this here again. And if we ever intend to do it someplace else, we have to find an area with a 150-mile radius uninhabited. Well, that's why I said earlier that if you draw a radius around Trinity 150 miles, it encompasses Albuquerque to the north, El Paso and parts of Mexico to the south, and almost our entire state to the east and west. We were downwind of the Nevada test site. They took the testing to Nevada because they found a place there which was essentially uninhabited with a 150-mile radius. But when the government went to Nevada to start the testing, they put monitors in place all over the West. And so there were actually monitoring stations in New Mexico, and those monitoring stations registered radiation through the summer of 1962 from every above ground test they did in Nevada. The compensation ends right at the New Mexico-Arizona border, as if at that border exists a lead curtain that offers us protection. Well, we all know that that's not true, and that's just insane. So not only did we receive very high doses from Trinity, because doses of radiation are a factor of distance and time. So the closer you live to the test site, especially a dirty bomb like Trinity, the more radiation exposure you got. So we got a high dose from Trinity, and then we got chronic dosing through the summer of 1962 from the Nevada test site. That fund that was set up in 1990, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, or RECA, has paid out over $2.3 billion in total claims. So not just to downwinders, but to uranium miners as well. We've been fighting for 10 years in the US Congress to get amendments to that bill, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, to include the people of New Mexico. We were the first downwinders any place in the world, the first people ever exposed to radiation, and we fully deserve to be compensated the same way other downwinders are. We don't deserve one dime less or one dime more than them. We just want social justice, and this is a moral and an ethical issue. I always tell people, don't try to muddy the waters. This is a moral and an ethical issue. The US government, in their rush to develop this nuclear device, tested it, and American citizens were harmed in that process, greatly harmed. And so what we know is that many, many people have suffered health consequences. I'm a cancer survivor. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer at the age of 39. And the first thing they asked me was, when were you exposed to radiation? I'm the fourth generation in my family to have cancer since 1945. Two of my great-grandfathers died from stomach cancer in 1955 at a time when they had no treatment for this, and at a time when you literally suffered and died a very horrible death. Both my grandmothers had cancer, although that's not what they died from. My dear father died from cancer after having 3 different cancers he didn't have risk factors for, but he was a 4-year-old child living in a downwind community in 1945, and he was greatly affected by this. So we're fighting for the compensation, the social justice that the people of New Mexico deserve. And we're also bringing attention to the fact that New Mexico right now is under consideration for a high-level storage facility in eastern New Mexico. They want to bring nuclear waste from all over the United States on the rail system and put it in the ground in eastern New Mexico. Well, they'll tell us it's safe, and I guess it is right until the minute it's not. And then when it's not, it's catastrophic. And if you think somebody's going to come back and take care of the problems they create, think again, because we've been waiting 75 years and no one's come back. People don't come back out of goodness to take care of and clean up these messes. And these messes are oftentimes catastrophic. And it doesn't just affect people that are alive and present at the time, but it affects our genetics, and we pass those genetics on to our children and our grandchildren. Sometimes people ask me, what can they do? Well, first of all, you can go to our website, which is www.trinitydownwinders.com, www.trinitydownwinders.com, and you can read more about our work, because I've only given you a very brief snapshot at what this is all about, but you can read more about our work and you can volunteer. And I'm always looking for students to do projects for us. And my contact information is at the website. You can always reach me through Highlands University. And we're always looking for people that might want to become part of our organization. This process, this invasion of our environment and our lives has cost us dearly. And let me tell you why. And it's had huge economic consequences. And I think maybe this is part of the most important part of this story that I want to share, and then I'll end. What people tell me all the time is, I had this great job, I had a retirement, I had health insurance, my wife and I were looking forward to our retirement. We planned on going, on trips, and we planned on helping our kids go to college, and we fully expected that we were going to have this great life. But I started to develop this pain in my abdomen, and I suffered with it for probably about 8 months. And then my wife said, I'm going to make you an appointment to see a doctor. And because there's no doctors in the community I live in, I traveled to Las Cruces to see a gastroenterologist. And they ran some tests on me. And then before long, they contacted me and said, you need to see an oncologist in El Paso. And they sent me to see an oncologist, and I had stage 4 colon cancer. And I tried to go 3 times a week to El Paso for treatment and keep working at my job, but there was just no way I could keep it up. And I had to quit. And I lost my health insurance, and I resorted to Medicaid. And I used all of my retirement to fund the trips back and forth to El Paso, to pay co-payments, to buy prescriptions. And then I took out the equity in my home. And then I maxed out 3 credit cards, and now my kids are sending me Visa credit cards so I can buy the gas to get back and forth to my treatments. And what happens is that we have no opportunity, when we have a sick population, we have no opportunity to develop any kind of generational wealth. The wealth that helps us put children through college, the wealth that helps us assist our kids when they're going to buy a new home, the kinds of things that other people get to do, we don't get to do. We get to spend everything we have at the end of our lives on taking care of our health. Why? Because most of the people who are overexposed to radiation live in rural areas where there's no access to health care. And so I have said over and over, and fully believe, because I've heard these stories all across the state, that this exposure to radiation that we have received in New Mexico through the summer of 1962 and beyond, actually, has has actually locked us into a cycle of poverty that we have not been able to break out of. Without the ability to develop generational wealth, you don't have the same opportunities that other people have. And so you may not identify as a downwinder or think that you're a downwinder, although everybody in New Mexico is. Let me just tell you, you are suffering the consequences of this, because 46% of all the people in New Mexico depend on Medicaid to access health care, the highest in the nation. And I know that a percentage of those people are uranium workers and are downwinders. And so I think with that, I would just like to maybe stop for a minute, and I would like to look at some of the things that are written in the chat and respond to any questions that anybody has. But this will obviously be my life's work if and when completed. And those of us who work on this every day of our lives are not going to stop this fight. We will never give up this fight. I always say this fight will go on until we achieve justice or until the day they put me in the ground. So with that, like I said, I think I'll end, and then I'll wait to see if there are any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Tina. And we do have some questions in the chat. I see one just now from Bill Garcia. What are the reasons that Congress gives for not addressing this obvious miscarriage of justice?
Hi, Bill. That's a great question. The answer most often given to us is that there's not enough money to take care of this. And I always say that adds so much more insult to injury, right? And that's not an adequate answer. And we will not settle for that, especially now that our government is passing trillion-dollar bills all the time in COVID relief, which, by the way, I totally understand and support. But let me tell you something about that. Being exposed to radiation sets you up as a special cohort inside of a pandemic. And it's part of the reason why we've seen such a horrid outbreak on the Navajo reservation. Those people, traditionally, many of them worked in the uranium mining industry and have underlying health effects that set them up for a terrible outcome inside of a pandemic. So we're a special cohort inside of a pandemic. And you know what? I firmly know that the government has enough money to take care of this, because we have defense bills in the trillions. So all they have to do is carve out a couple $2 billion and put it into RICA and start paying claims in New Mexico. A lot of people think that the only one that can apply for one of these claims is a person who's alive and sick now, but that is not true. You can apply on behalf of a deceased loved one. And the amendments to RICA that we're fighting for would include the entire state of New Mexico. And let me also add that it is a known fact, because the government sent out search planes to follow the main part of the plume as it made its way all the way across the United States to the Atlantic Ocean, damaging film in a Kodak plant in New York. That's how serious this radiation was. As that plume traversed New Mexico, it went over the top of San Miguel County, very well documented. And so we need to do more outreach into the Las Vegas area and San Miguel County, because of the known fact that the plume, the major part of the plume, went over San Miguel. But that is the answer that they give us, Bill, that there is not enough money to take care of us. Precisely why I say we cannot accept Holtec bringing high-level waste here, because if there is a disaster, and incidentally, there was never supposed to be a disaster at WIP either, but if there is a disaster, they're not going to come back and take care of it. They're going to leave us here on our own to deal with it, like they have for 75 years after Trinity.
Tina, we have another question that came earlier. You've talked about the Trinity site. What about the continued use of radiation plutonium medical experiments done during post-war years and up through the 90s? Is it true that Manhattan's medical doctors used secret plutonium injections on hundreds of patients across hospitals in our country for experiments?
Well, I will tell you that I have heard about this, and this isn't an area that I'm an expert on, but I have heard about this. And there have always been these basically cohort studies that have taken place that haven't been completely out in the open, and that we've heard about years later. And now that they unclassify more and more information, we're finding more and more information out about the types of studies that they did, similar to what you've just asked about. And so I'm certain that that did take place, and I'm certain that the government has done a great job of suppressing information so that they don't have to take responsibility for the outcome afterwards. And the Trinity test is very, very much shrouded in secrecy. It was from the beginning, to the extent that they didn't even care about safety. Safety was not of concern to them. Secrecy was of concern. So other studies, human studies, obviously have taken place, and they have obviously suppressed that information as well, because they don't want to have to take responsibility for the negative health outcomes associated with these sorts of things.
Yes. May I ask a follow-up question to Tina? This is Bill Garcia. Tina, I know that you've been before Congress many, many times, and that Senator Udall has sponsored legislation which will help adjust this grievance that is real. Where does all of that stand? Are you making progress with that, or are you hopeful? What are the prospects for success? I know you've been at it for a long time.
Bill, thank you for the question. And I have had a chance to testify in 2 Senate committees, the Senate Judiciary Committee and the Senate Indian Affairs Committee. As you well know, the Senate Judiciary Committee has been maybe the most occupied committee of all the committees in the Senate as of the last 4 years. And because of that, consideration to something like what we're proposing is almost of little to no concern for the Senate Judiciary Committee. When I testified, it was very obvious that the senators who were present in the room understood the issue, believe it to be a social justice issue, and if it had been left up to them, there would have been a vote taken immediately. The unfortunate thing is, when I testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee, Senator Grassley was the chairman, and he was relieved of those duties soon after and was replaced by Senator Lindsey Graham, and we have not been able to get any traction with the new chairman. Now, I did have an opportunity, our representative, Ben Ray Lujan from Northern New Mexico, arranged, because he's the primary sponsor in the House bill, and we fully support the House bill. It's House Bill 3783, because Ben Ray Lujan allowed us to interface with him very closely and his staff to craft that bill so that it goes far enough. And he's the primary sponsor, and we have tens. I mean, I think there's 38 or 40 co-sponsors now, and it's bipartisan supported. He arranged a recent teleconference with Representative Nadler, who's the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, and again, a committee that's been extremely busy over the last 4 years. And Representative Nadler was very, very responsive. He said, I understand this. We have to do something. It's a social justice issue. We have responsibilities here that we cannot walk away from. And he said, I will do everything to get a hearing scheduled and get a vote scheduled. So we take Representative Nadler at his word. And I will tell you that every day it's a step closer and a step closer. And I really do believe that there are going to be collection that we're in the middle of right now. And we're very hopeful that in the next Congress, if we don't get a hearing before the end of the year, Representative Nadler said he'd do what he could before the end of the year. But if that doesn't happen, we're very hopeful that in the next Congress, we'll see more movement. And so we continue to lobby. And Bill, we have people working with us from all over the country now. I work with national organizations like Union of Concerned Scientists, who are completely in support of us, the National Organization of Physicians for Social Responsibility, who completely support us. And we really have taken, this movement has taken on a lot of momentum as of late. And add the 75th anniversary of Trinity to this, and we've gathered a lot of attention worldwide, actually. And so when people here ask me what to do, our entire congressional delegation supports us, every single one of them. But it never hurts to just, if you have an opportunity, send an email or make a phone call to, our congressional folks and let them know that this is an issue for you and your family, that you're concerned about it and that you've been affected by it, and that you'd like to see them continue to support this. I hope that answers your question, Bill. And hi, Eileen.
Can I do a quick follow-up? I don't want to, if anybody else has a question, I'll wait, but I like a follow-up here. So I'm assuming when you talk about the government, we're talking about the Department of Energy. Are they the lead agency that would offer countervailing testimony or supportive testimony when you get in front of a Senate or House committee? The government would be represented by some agency. Can you help us with that?
Well, the program that RICA is administered through is the Department of Labor, which is a little bit odd, but that was done because some of the claims are related to work processes like uranium mining. But when we had the hearing in the Senate, there was really nobody there that offered counter testimony. And that's a good thing, Bill. Actually, there's already been an admission by the government to the fact that they harmed people in the process of nuclear testing because they compensate people downwind of the Nevada test site, right? Those people never had to rise to this level of proof, the level of proof that we have had to assume. For example, right now we're collecting affidavits from people from all over New Mexico talking about how they accessed water in 1945, because there was a recent National Cancer Institute study released saying that actually people accessed water in 1945 through wells. Well, we know that that's not true because, number one, people didn't have the resources to dig wells, and they didn't have, and they just didn't have the ability to dig wells. It was much easier to put a cistern in place. And you're looking at the difference between deep water that was sometimes brackish or very alkaline versus water that was collected off your rooftops into a containment vessel. And, so we are constantly having to rise to some level of proof that we were harmed. But we now have a very well-known and well-respected nuclear engineer and health physicist. His name is Dr. Joseph Shanka. He's out of Georgia, and he has produced a lecture, and it's talking about Trinity being the first dirty bomb. And he has actually surmised that the exposures to the people in New Mexico were worse than anything ever received at Chernobyl or any of the other test sites. And he has put together some fascinating data that can't be refuted. He's an expert on Trinity. He spent 10 years of his life studying Trinity. And it's staggering, Bill. Through a study that he worked on, they actually sort of took a stab at what they thought the exposures were the day of the event. And they said it could have been as much as 10,000 times what's considered acceptable today. And I always say, try wrapping your mind around that. And then try wrapping your mind around the fact that 10 pounds of radioactive plutonium has a half-life of 24,000 years, went up in that fireball and then was dispersed all over New Mexico. It's going to be here for the remainder of time.
Tina,
and so we do have.
What's the legislative number in the Senate, or is it you carrying the House bill in the Senate now? Is that it? What's that reference?
Okay, the House bill is House Bill 3783, and that's the bill that we fully believe in. It goes far enough. It has provisions in there that would cover New Mexicans from 1945 through 1962. The Senate bill is 947. Of course, we support that, but those bills are going to have to be reconciled so that there's an adequate qualification period for the people of New Mexico. The Senate bill has a 1-month period designated basically July through August of 1945. That will not work, Bill, for some very obvious reasons, and the main one being that it'll be an impossibility for people 75 years later to prove that they lived in New Mexico for that one narrow month. So we worked with Representative Lujan to make sure that it went far enough and it covered us through the time period when we were exposed at the Nevada test site, through the Nevada test site.
God bless you for your perseverance and your leadership on this, Tina. It's remarkable.
Well, I appreciate you, Bill. I appreciate your continued support. You and Eileen have been a blessing in my travels through this journey. So I do appreciate you all very much, and everything, you know, everything that Highlands has done. And there are other things, and I'll be in touch with, maybe you and I can speak about it offline, Bill, but there are some projects that Highlands could take on that are associated with this. And we could talk about that a little bit more. The Board of Regents might be interested in it. But imagine bringing back several $billion to the people of New Mexico. If you can file a claim on behalf of a deceased loved one, that money would be an immediate infusion of capital into our economy in New Mexico. And it would be significant.
Yeah,
let's talk.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, and the House bill, by the way, takes the compensation payment from $50,000 to $150,000, which is necessary because we're talking about being deprived for 30 years of having access to that fund. And so that's another reason why we support the House bill. Thank you all so much and have a wonderful day today.
Tina.
Yes. Oh. Hi.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay. I'm navigating through this screen and I think I lost you all visually, but anyway, as long as you can hear me.
I can see and hear you, Viola.
Oh, okay. Really? Okay. Yeah, I have a question and some comments. And before I begin asking the question, Tina, I wanted to congratulate you on your recent recognition in Latina in Style here in Albuquerque. That's a tremendous kudo to you. So congratulations on that.
Thank you, Viola.
You're welcome. Okay, I have really read a lot of books written by UNM professors in regard to the atomic bomb explosion here in 1945. And in regard to the RECA, the compensation, the restitution for individuals who were impacted adversely, medically and physically, in every way, emotionally. Is it my understanding that Congressman Tom Udall played a big role in getting the restitution to the Nevada residents through RECA accomplished? And did those, and I guess my piggyback question is, if the RECA successfully compensated those individuals in Nevada, it makes sense to ask why not in New Mexico. And my guess is, did those individuals apply for compensation through RECA individually as individuals? And is that a factor? And maybe, I mean, I don't understand. Is it, because I heard you say all of New Mexico residents have suffered from this. And so therefore, it kind of makes it sound like a class action lawsuit in some respect. Is it an entire group that you're advocating be compensated for this injustice in New Mexico? Or is it separate parties, separate individuals?
So let me tell you the history of RECA, Viola, because you're exactly right. The Udall family was instrumental in the development of the restitution, and this is how that happened. Stuart Udall, who was the Secretary of the Interior, when he retired, he went back to Utah, and he actually was contacted by lots of people who said, we have been harmed by the testing that was done in Nevada. And it's very true that when they tested in Nevada, they would do those tests to correspond with wind patterns that would take the fallout away from Las Vegas and Los Angeles and San Francisco and move it east. So the people who were most affected were people in Utah, the poor farmers and ranchers in Utah. So Stuart Udall was made aware of this. And Tom Udall, our senator, was newly out of law school. And Tom Udall told me this story face to face. We had the discussion about this. This is how I know the story so well. And Tom Udall told me, my father decided to start filing lawsuits on behalf of individuals in the court system, okay? And these lawsuits were making their way through the court system, and they were literally affirming that people were harmed in the process of testing these devices, but they were also saying that it was in the interest of national security, so the government couldn't be held accountable for the effects. They made it all the way to the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals, and Stuart Udall said we're going to have the same outcome in the Supreme Court. This has to be resolved differently. And he made his way to a meeting with Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah, and he said, we have to come up with a political resolve to this issue. And that's the development of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. Now, I have been told, but I'm not an expert in this area, that one lawsuit made its way through the court, and that one individual was granted about $5 million. So what happened, and this is only what I surmise, what happened is that to mitigate these claims, to make sure that they were reduced in nature, they decided to put together this compensation fund, which was capped at $50,000. That's big. There's a big difference between $50,000 and $5 million. So that fund designated areas of Colorado, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona to receive compensation, but New Mexico was never included. Why? I always say that's the $2.5 billion question. Who was looking out for us? Nobody. Senator Udall has told me, Tina, at the time that we worked on this, we didn't know people in New Mexico had been harmed. That was outside of our realization. So nobody from New Mexico was included. Now the work that we're doing absolutely extends to everybody in New Mexico. It's not limited by counties. It's not limited by locations, proximity to the test site, none of that. It clearly states that if you lived in New Mexico from 1945 to 1962, and you can prove that you were here and you have developed one of the 22 compensable cancers, then you can apply to the fund and you can be compensated. We have thought about filing some class action lawsuits, Viola, to get the attention of the government or to make its way through the court system, either way. But I will tell you that that is not something too outside of the realm of what we may have to do if we can't get these bills passed. The other thing that we are standing up against right now is the original RECA bill sunsets in 2022. We've lost all of 2020 to the pandemic. If we don't have success in 2021, we're gonna, the heavy lift that we've been, undertaking is now gonna become almost an impossibility.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, Tina. I'm afraid we're at time for our talk. What a great talk and so much knowledge. We're so thankful that you're working on this issue for all the people of New Mexico. Thank you so much.
Thank you too, Terry and Julie and Viola. Sometime you and I can talk further about this, but thank you all so much and have a wonderful day today.
Oh,
Thank
you
you.
too. Thank you all. Stay safe.
Stay safe.